The morning she came back to Hartwood Hall, the sky was the same low gray it had been 6 months before, and she was glad of it. Cecily Vane stood at the bottom of the stone steps and looked up at the door. It was a door she knew well now, in the way one knows a thing that has become interior. A door that had been closed before she had finished speaking. Closed while the rain was still on her face. The hall behind it had smelled of beeswax and dried flowers, and there had been a fire lit somewhere deep in the house that she had not been invited to share. She had stood on those steps for perhaps 30 seconds after the door shut, holding her father's leather satchel against her coat, listening to the sound of her own breathing in the wet November air. That had been November. This was the last week of April. She was still holding the satchel. It felt different now. Not lighter, exactly, but settled in her hand the way a thing feels when it has found its purpose. She had carried it to 3 offices in London, to a set of first-floor chambers near Lincoln's Inn, where a clerk had looked over her father's papers for 2 weeks while she waited in a rented room on half-rations, counting the coins in her purse against the cost of ink and legal fees. She had carried it through 3 months of service as companion to a Mrs. Alderton of Bath, who had kind eyes and a habit of forgetting to pay her quarterly stipend. She had carried it onto a mail coach in the dark before dawn, and up a chalk road through wet fields and into this gray April morning, to these steps. She climbed them. The door opened before she could knock. Mrs. Holt stood in the entrance, the housekeeper's cap slightly askew, her broad face fixed in an expression that Cecily could not immediately read. Then the woman's shoulders dropped, and the expression resolved itself into something like relief. "Miss Vane," she said in a low voice. "Mrs. Holt." Cecily said it quietly. The satchel was in her right hand. The housekeeper glanced over her shoulder into the hall, then back at Cecily. "There is a dinner tonight," she said. "Lady Eugenia has guests expected. His lordship is in residence." Cecily had known this. She had timed her arrival to correspond with it. She met Mrs. Holt's eyes, and the housekeeper stepped aside, because she was a woman who had spent 40 years reading what a room required of her. And she understood what she read now. Cecily stepped through the door into Hartwood Hall and felt the warmth of it close around her, like something she had been owed. She had not been in this hall before. She had seen it in the 6 seconds between the door opening and the door closing, 6 months ago, a cold November morning with rain soaking through her coat. She had seen the marble floor, the curve of the staircase, a vase of late autumn flowers on a console table, a woman standing in the middle of it all as if she had been placed there by a painter. Lady Eugenia Corrin, aunt to the late Viscount Ashvale and self-appointed regent of his household, had looked at Cecily Vane across 20 feet of marble with the particular stillness of a woman who has never once been refused anything she wished to refuse herself. She had not crossed the hall. She had not descended to the door. She had held her ground in the middle of her marble floor and said, in a voice calibrated to carry to every listening servant in the rooms beyond, that she did not know what a tradesman's daughter thought she was doing, knocking at a family's front door like a beggar in the rain, but she was to take herself and whatever papers she was clutching back to London, because the debts of the late Lord Ashvale had been a matter for his estate and his solicitor, and no one else, and that matter was closed. The door had closed with it. Cecily had stood on the step in the rain and held her father's satchel and felt the world arrange itself around her in a shape she recognized, the old familiar shape of a woman whose worth has been estimated at a glance and found insufficient. She was 23 years old. Her father had been dead 8 months. His small solicitor's practice had been dissolved into the estate, his books catalogued and sold, his correspondence filed. She had taken what the law permitted her to take, which amounted to 1 trunk of clothing, a small annuity of £40 per year, and a leather satchel containing several of his private papers. Among them a promissory note, signed by the late Lord Ashvale, and witnessed by two men whose names she recognized, in the amount of £430, secured against the property at Hartwood Hall, in the event of default. Her father had not told her about the note during his lifetime. She found it 3 weeks after his death, pressed between the leaves of a volume of Blackstone he had kept beside his reading chair. She had carried it to his former clerk in London, who had looked at it for a long time before telling her, with some care, that she had in her hands a legal instrument of real value. If the note was valid, and if the estate of the late Lord Ashvale could not satisfy it through other means, then the security itself, that is to say, the hall and its grounds, could be attached. She had taken the matter to Mr. Nathaniel Cope of Lincoln's Inn, a quiet man with ink-stained fingers and a thorough understanding of the laws of mortgage and of debt. He had taken 2 weeks. Then he had told her that the promissory note was sound, that the late Lord Ashvale had died intestate with the hall mortgaged against it, and that the estate had not, as Lady Eugenia had claimed at the door, been settled at all. The note had simply not been presented in time by a woman who had not known it existed. Mr. Cope had then explained, with some delicacy, that there was a path available to her that would require the remainder of her father's small capital and a degree of patience. She could assign the note to a third party, who could then pursue the mortgage claim through the court at a cost she could not bear, or she could accept an instrument of transfer from a creditor of the estate, one to whom a larger sum was owed, who was willing to settle his own claim partly in kind. The deed to Hartwood Hall, in other words. Cecily had paid the last £212 of her father's estate to make the transfer possible. It had taken 3 months to conclude. She had spent those 3 months as a paid companion to Mrs. Alderton, who had asked her once over a winter evening tea whether she had any intention of remarrying, and Cecily had said very gently that she had not married yet, and Mrs. Alderton had looked at her with kind, confused eyes and not pressed the matter. A Mr. Greville of Bath had presented himself toward the end of January, a widower of considerable property and amiable disposition, and had said with some warmth that he thought they might suit very well. Cecily had sat with the offer for 3 days. She had thought about her father's satchel, and about what it had felt like to stand in the rain before a closed door. Then she had thanked Mr. Greville sincerely and declined, because she was not willing to sell her name to a man she did not know simply to purchase safety, and because she had found, in the course of the winter, that she would rather be a woman who acted on what she believed than one who arranged herself according to what the season required. Mr. Cope had sent word in the first week of April. The transfer was complete. If you happen to be listening tonight, know that what she carried in that leather satchel had been bought with everything her father left her and 3 months of careful, quietly principled living, and that she had not wavered once. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. She was admitted to a guest room on the first floor, a small room at the east end of the corridor, and she set the satchel on the writing desk and went to the window and looked out at the hall's grounds in the April light. The gardens were beginning, tentative green at the edge of the lawn, the stone balustrade damp from last night's rain. Somewhere below her, a groom was leading a horse across the stable yard, and above the roofline of the east wing, the sky was beginning to pale toward noon. She had not slept on the coach. She sat down in the chair by the window and was asleep within minutes. The satchel on the desk behind her, her father's note inside it, everything in order. It was not yet dawn when she woke. The house was still. She dressed in the gray half-light and took the satchel and went downstairs to find the library. She found it by following the smell of old paper and the faint thread of cold air that came from under a door at the west end of the ground-floor corridor. The room was enormous, floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, a desk at the far end with 2 candlesticks unlit, and a set of account books laid open on the leather surface. She went to the desk and opened the first book. She had been standing there perhaps 20 minutes, reading the estate's accounts by the light of the window's early gray, when she heard the door behind her. She turned. The man in the doorway was tall, dark-haired, 30 or so, in a coat that was not yet fully done up at the collar, as though he had come from his own room in haste. He had the face of a man who had not slept well in some time, a face held very still over what was underneath it. He looked at her across the length of the library and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Put those down." His voice was level, not raised. The voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed without requiring volume. She had not removed her hands from the account book. She kept them where they were and said, "I have a reason to be here, my lord." "No doubt you believe so." He came into the room. He was watching her the way she had seen men watch an account that did not balance. "You are the woman Mrs. Holt admitted last night." "Yes." "Without my knowledge." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "I did not wish to arrive in the middle of your evening. I intended to make myself known to you this morning." He was at the desk now, on the other side of it, close enough that she could see the particular quality of stillness in his face, not coldness exactly, but the discipline of a man who had learned to keep his expression at rest when he wished to think. He looked at her hands on the account book. Then he looked at the satchel. "What is in there?" he said. "Papers," she said. "Which I will explain in full, my lord, when your household solicitor is also present." Something moved in his face at that, very briefly. She did not know what it was. He said, with the same level register, "You will stay out of the account books until then." "Certainly," she said, and removed her hands. She moved to take a chair by the window, and he watched her do it. He did not ask her to leave. He did not send for a footman. He stood at his own desk in the gray morning light, and she could feel his attention on her back as she looked out at the garden. And she told herself it was calculation. She told herself it was the wariness of a man who had found a stranger in his library, which was a reasonable thing to feel. She looked at the garden. The lawn was wet from the night's rain, and a pair of rooks were working at something in the grass near the stone balustrade, unhurried, with the authority of birds that have never once been refused their patch of ground. Somewhere below the window, the stable yard was beginning to stir. A groom's voice, the sound of a pail. She was aware, with a specific and inconvenient precision, of exactly where in the room he was standing. Aware of the particular quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man waiting for her to leave, but the stillness of a man who had not yet decided what he thought. She had grown up watching her father's clients sit across a desk and do exactly this, arrange themselves around an unknown fact. And she knew what it looked like when a careful person was in the act of revising an estimate. She did not know what he was revising. She did not allow herself to speculate. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the wet garden, and kept her breathing deliberate and even, because the alternative was to let him hear that she was not as composed as she appeared. And that was not information she was prepared to offer. She did not look back at him. She knew exactly when he left the room. He was absent from the hall that morning. She walked the kitchen gardens with Mrs. Holt, who spoke carefully about the changes since the new lord had arrived in January, how he had dismissed the Dowager's London footman and reduced the household staff by 3 and insisted the tenants' rents be reviewed. He had been in the army before his inheritance, Mrs. Holt said, and then stopped herself and said only that he had seen things that altered a man's sense of what mattered. Cecily was crossing the kitchen passage on her way back inside when she heard the woman's voice from the scullery door. She stopped. A widow. Old, bent, holding a piece of paper in both hands as though it might dissolve. She was explaining something to the kitchen girl that she could not make sense of, a notice about her tenancy, the wording of it, something about a clause. The kitchen girl was patient, but not learned enough to help. Cecily went in. She read the notice twice. It was a routine renewal, clumsily worded by a junior clerk, but there was no real threat in it. She sat with the woman for 10 minutes and explained it, clause by clause. The woman's hands were shaking from the cold. Cecily worked her own gloves off and pressed them into the woman's palms, and the woman looked at them, and then at her. And Cecily said that she had no further use for them today, and they were plain enough to be practical. She walked back up through the kitchen passage and into the hall, and became aware, some 3 or 4 seconds after it would have mattered, that someone had been standing in the shadow of the corridor doorway. Lord Ashvale had not moved. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance, though the middle distance happened to be the scullery door she had just come through. He had the look of a man who had been standing there long enough to see everything and had made no decision about what to do with it. She stopped walking. He looked at her. She looked at him. The kitchen passage was narrow and smelled of flour and the cold from the flagstone floor, and the distance between them was perhaps 6 feet, and she was aware of her own hands, one of them without a glove now, the bare fingers cold. He did not say anything. Neither did she. Then he stepped back from the doorway and went the other way down the corridor, and she heard his footfall on the stair, even and unhurried, and was left in the passage with the flour smell and the flagstone cold, and a feeling she could not precisely name, something in the region of her sternum that she chose, firmly, to attribute to the chill of the morning. She did not stop. She went upstairs to her room. She sat by the window with her father's satchel on her lap, and thought about the hall's accounts, about the tenancy rolls she had glimpsed, about the way Lord Ashvale had stood at his desk and said nothing for a long moment before he found words. She did not allow herself to think about the kitchen passage. She was not here for that. That evening she learned, from Mrs. Holt, that Lord Ashvale had gone into his study after mid-morning and had not emerged until the dressing bell. She learned that he had been observed standing for some time before the east window of the study, not moving, long enough that the footman who had gone in to tend the fire had gone very quietly and come out again without being acknowledged. She did not ask what this meant. She let it settle where it had landed and went to dress for dinner. The dinner was her first understanding of the full arrangement of the house. The table seated 14. There were 8 at it tonight. Lord Ashvale sat at the head, Lady Eugenia at his right hand, Miss Dorothea Featherstone at his left, a clergyman and his wife, a neighboring baron and his daughter, and Cecily at the far end, placed there by Mrs. Holt's quiet insistence and Lady Eugenia's visible reluctance to make a scene over the seating arrangement. Miss Featherstone wore ice-blue silk. She was very beautiful and very composed, and she spoke to Lord Ashvale in the measured tones of a woman who has been told her whole life that she is the correct answer to whatever question a gentleman might be asking. She had a way of turning her head toward Lord Ashvale that managed to exclude the rest of the table entirely without appearing to try. Lady Eugenia wore diamonds. She wore them the way other women wore convictions. She did not look at Cecily directly for the first 3 courses. Then she leaned toward Miss Featherstone during the fish and said, in a voice that carried the length of the table with perfect precision, that she hoped the journey from Bath had not been too wearing, as the roads had been poor since the late rains. And of course the hall had been somewhat crowded with uninvited presences lately, the sort that appeared at doors with papers and pretensions. A tradesman's daughter come to beg, still clinging to this roof. The table's conversation did not stop. It stuttered, and then continued, and there were faces that kept very carefully forward. Cecily watched her own glass and felt her hand steady on the stem of it, a deliberate act of the body that had nothing to do with calm. Lord Ashvale, at the head of the table, set down his fork. The gesture was small. The table did not remark on it. Cecily saw it from the far end, the way his hand rested flat on the cloth for a moment before he reached for his wine, and she filed it away in the part of herself that she was not yet ready to open. Miss Featherstone said something gracious about the roads. The dinner continued. Lady Eugenia waited until the guests had gone to the drawing-room after dinner before she found Cecily in the corridor near the foot of the stairs. She was not angry, exactly. She was composed in the manner of a woman who has identified a problem and is arranging its removal. She stood in the corridor and told Cecily, without raising her voice, that she was aware of the matter of the promissory note, and that she had already been in correspondence with her own solicitor in London, a Mr. Fitch, who was satisfied that the note could be contested on grounds of procedural irregularity. She said that the instrument of transfer, if one existed, would be found defective. She said that Cecily would be better served by returning to London in the morning and allowing Mr. Fitch to address the matter in the courts, where it belonged. She said it pleasantly. She said it the way the door had been closed in November, with the precise application of authority that had never once been questioned. Cecily said that she would consider what had been said. She went upstairs and sat by the window in her room with the satchel on her lap in the dark, and did not sleep. Below her the dinner guests departed by carriage, one after another, the crunch of gravel and the sound of wheels fading into the lane. Eventually, the house grew quiet. She sat and listened to it settle. In the morning, Mr. Cope arrived from London. He had not arrived alone. He had brought, at Lord Ashvale's express request, 2 copies of the instrument of transfer and a sworn affidavit from the third party who had assigned it, documents that Cecily had not known existed in that form until Mr. Cope laid them on the hall table and explained in his quiet manner that his lordship had sent for him the previous evening after receiving certain information from his steward. The steward had come to Lord Ashvale late in the evening, after the guests had gone. He had reported that Lady Eugenia had spoken of Miss Vane that morning to the footman in the servants' passage near the linen room, in precisely the terms she had used 6 months before at the front door. A tradesman's daughter come to beg, nothing more, the kind of woman whose father had put on airs above his station and left his child with pretensions no decent solicitor would entertain. The steward had said it plainly, because Lord Ashvale had asked him to say anything relevant to the matter of Miss Vane plainly. Lord Ashvale had listened. He had gone very still. He had asked one question. Had Lady Eugenia personally turned Miss Vane away from this house in November? The steward had said yes. He had been present. It had been raining. Miss Vane had stood on the step for some time after the door closed. Lord Ashvale had dismissed the steward and had gone to his study and had remained there until the first hour of the morning. He had sent word to Mr. Cope's London office before midnight. The drawing-room was arranged that morning as though for a formal conference. Lady Eugenia had stationed herself in the high-backed chair nearest the fire, with Mr. Fitch beside her, and Miss Featherstone in a chair near the window, present as a witness to the correction she was certain would follow. The room smelled of lilies and beeswax, and the faint, expensive cold of a house where fires are banked overnight to save the coal. Cecily came in behind Mr. Cope, the leather satchel in her hand. Lord Ashvale was standing to the side of the fireplace, not seated, not in the arrangement his aunt had prepared. He looked at Cecily when she entered, a look she felt rather than assessed. And then he looked at Mr. Fitch. Mr. Cope set his documents on the writing table. He unrolled the instrument of transfer and placed beside it the promissory note and the affidavit. He explained the chain of title in precise sequence. He was not a theatrical man. He did not raise his voice. He simply laid each document in its proper relation to the next, the way one lays a hand of cards on a table to demonstrate that the game is over. Mr. Fitch reviewed the instrument. He reviewed it a second time. The room was very quiet. Cecily opened the satchel. She took out the deed to Hartwood Hall. She placed it on the table. Mr. Fitch looked at it. He looked at Mr. Cope. He looked at the floor. Lord Ashvale crossed the room. He did not cross it quickly. He crossed it with the deliberate, measured stride of a man who has made a decision and is not uncertain about it. 3 long steps from the fireplace to the writing table, and when he stopped, he was standing beside Cecily, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the room's morning cold. He looked at the assembled room. Lady Eugenia had not moved. Miss Featherstone had turned from the window. "Miss Vane holds the deed," Lord Ashvale said, his voice the same level register she had heard in the library at dawn, the same voice that required no volume because it had never required it. "This house is hers." The fan in Lady Eugenia's hand went still. It was the silence that registered most. The room did not murmur. It held its breath. Miss Featherstone took a single step back from the window, not retreating, simply repositioning, the way one repositions when the ground shifts slightly underfoot. Mr. Fitch folded his papers. Lady Eugenia said, "You cannot mean." She stopped. Her composure did not break entirely, but it reorganized itself into something that was no longer certainty. She said more quietly, "Julian." Lord Ashvale did not answer his aunt. He turned to Cecily. He extended his hand. Not as an offer of assistance, not as a social courtesy. As a deliberate, public, unhurried act in a room that had decided who she was 6 months ago and found its assessment overturned, she looked at his hand for 1 beat. Then she took it. His fingers closed over hers, warm and firm, and she felt her own hand stop trembling, which was when she understood it had been trembling at all. Mr. Cope, with the practiced discretion of a man who had witnessed many hinge moments, gathered his documents and moved toward the door. He paused long enough to say that he would leave copies of the relevant instruments with the hall's steward for the estate's records. Then he left, quietly, and the door closed behind him without drama. Lady Eugenia gathered herself by degrees. She said, to no one in particular, that she would require time to make arrangements. Lord Ashvale said that she would be provided with every accommodation she required, that the dower property in Wiltshire remained hers by right of her late husband's will, and that he would ensure the transition was made with full comfort. He said it without triumph. He said it the way one closes a chapter that has been held open too long, with care for the binding rather than satisfaction at the ending. Miss Featherstone took her leave within the hour. She was gracious about it. She was a woman who had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice, and she recognized, with a quality of dignity that Cecily could not help but admire, that the correct choice had been made elsewhere. It was not for several weeks that Cecily understood what had happened entirely. There was much to understand. There were tenancy agreements to be reviewed and accounts to be put in order. And Mr. Cope made 2 further visits from London in the course of May. There was the matter of the household staff, who had watched the drawing-room scene with the precise, invisible attentiveness of people whose livelihoods depend on knowing which way the wind has changed, and who adjusted to Cecily's authority with a tact that suggested they had been hoping for the change longer than she knew. Mrs. Holt went about the house with her cap slightly less askew and an expression of permanent, mild satisfaction. Lord Ashvale was at the Hall for the first week, and then in London for 2, and then back again. He did not explain himself, and she did not require explanation. She was not entirely sure what the arrangement between them was, except that it was something, and that something was being built the way the spring was being built, gradually, with long, dry stretches between the small, visible signs of what was coming. He found her one morning in the library, not at dawn this time, but at a reasonable hour, with the windows open to the May air and the account books closed beside her on the desk. She had been reading. She looked up when he came in. He crossed the room without the quality of decision he had carried in the drawing room. This crossing was quieter, less ceremonial, the crossing of a man who knows where he is going and is simply going there. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "You were not present in November." "I was not." He came to a stop a few feet from her chair. His face was still, as it always was. But the stillness had a different quality in it now. Something held at the surface that she was beginning to learn to read. "I was not present, and the house that bears my name closed a door in your face while you were standing in the rain with your father's papers in your hand." She looked at him. She said, "What was done by one who believed she had authority." "She believed it because I allowed it," he said. "And I allowed it because I was not paying attention to what I had been given." He paused. "That is the precise failure I mean to correct." She did not say anything for a moment. Outside the open window, a thrush was working through a sequence in the apple tree by the garden wall, starting and stopping and starting again. He said, "I should like to show you something," and went to the desk near the bookshelves and came back with something in his hand, flat and rectangular, perhaps 8 inches across. He gave it to her. It was a watercolor, half finished. Mountains in the distance, blue and gray and tentative, a sky begun and abandoned, the brush left mid-stroke so that a streak of gray ran off the paper's edge as though the painter had simply stopped and not returned. In the corner, in very small letters, M.C. 1814. Cecily held it. Cecily held. She looked at the unfinished mountains. "My sister," he said. He said it simply, the 2 words given the weight of the thing they contained and no more. "She died at Hartwood Hall in the winter of 14. A fever," he said. He said it in the same level voice, the voice that did not rise, and she understood from the quality of the level that it had been an effort to achieve it, and that the effort was old and well practiced. Marian had been 20 years old and in delicate health the previous autumn, and he had sent her to the Hall to convalesce because his aunt had offered the south-facing rooms and said the Hall's air was better than London's in the winter months. He had not been present. He had been on the continent, winding up the last of his military obligations, and he had written to the Hall weekly and received in return letters that said she was comfortable, that the rooms were warm, that she was eating a little better. She had not been warm. The physician's fees had seemed, to Lady Eugenia's calculation, excessive for what had presented at first as a manageable ailment, and there had been an interval of 3 days in which the more senior man had not been sent for because she had not yet authorized the expense. In those 3 days, Marian had worsened past what any physician could then address. He had received the letter of her death 2 weeks after the fact, somewhere on the road between Brussels and Calais. He had not spoken of it, he said, to anyone who had not already known. He had not spoken of it at the Hall, because the Hall had become a place where the subject of Marian existed only as a surface no one touched. "I believed," he said, and then he stopped. He tried again. "I believed that it was my failure." that I had placed her in the wrong hands because I had not looked carefully enough at what those hands were. She understood. She had known there was a wound, known from the way he held himself at certain moments, from the set of his shoulders in the kitchen passage doorway when he had stood there watching her explain a tenancy notice to an old woman in the cold. She had known it was specific and serious, and that it was his to name. She looked at the unfinished mountains, the brush stroke that ran off the edge. She did not say she was sorry. She said, "She had real gift." Looking at the particular way the blue had been handled at the peak, tentative and exact at once, she would have become very good. His breath changed. Not visibly. She felt it rather than saw it. He said, "Cecily." She looked up at him. He had not said her given name before. She had not heard it in his voice before, and the difference between her name read in a letter and her name spoken by this particular voice, in this room, with the thrush starting again outside the window, was the difference between knowing a piece of music and hearing it played by someone who understood what it meant. He said it once. He did not repeat it. He did not elaborate. He reached out carefully and took the watercolor from her hands and set it on the desk beside them. And then he looked at her in the morning light without saying anything further. And she let herself be looked at, which was the thing she had not permitted before, and which required a particular kind of courage she had not known she possessed until she was exercising it. He was close, not touching. She was aware of the exact quality of the air between them, the warmth of it, the particular stillness that required no words and did not improve with words. Her heart was loud. She let it be loud. He said quietly, "I do not intend to do this wrong." She looked at him. He was not a man who said things simply to fill a room. She said, "No." And then, because she had learned over the course of this spring that she was a woman who said what she meant when it mattered, she said, "Neither do I." She could feel her pulse in her throat. She could feel the precise weight of the watercolor still warm from her hands. She was aware of the distance between them, and aware that it was not the kind of distance that improved with maintaining, and she was aware that she wanted, specifically and without qualification, for him to close it, and that this wanting was not something she had permitted herself before, and that she was permitting it now because she had run out of reasons not to. He did not move at once. He looked at her with the expression she had begun to learn, the one that was not blankness but its opposite. Everything held still at the surface because what was below it was too considered to release without care. She understood it now. She had not always. "Cecily," he said again. She did not look away. The thrush finished its phrase and started again. In the late afternoon light, the library settled around them. The old paper smell and the warm May air and the sound of the stable yard below the window, where a groom was calling to another in an ordinary voice about an ordinary thing. And Cecily thought about a door closing in the rain, and about everything on the other side of it that the door had not been able to keep. She thought about her father's voice reading Blackstone aloud to himself in the evening, the particular pleasure he had taken in the precision of legal language, the way he had believed that a well-drawn instrument was a small act of justice made permanent. She thought he would have found this particular morning very satisfying. In the weeks that followed, there were formal arrangements to be made, and Mr. Cope made a third visit, and there were letters exchanged between Lord Ashvale's man of business and her own, which was to say, Mr. Cope acting temporarily in both capacities, which he did with equanimity. The neighboring baron called and was civil, and the clergyman and his wife called and were warm, and Mrs. Holt baked a particular pie that she was known to produce only at moments of household celebration, and then feigned surprise when remarked upon. There was a morning in June, quite early, before the house was fully awake, when Cecily came down to the library and found the desk already occupied. He was not reading. He was sitting with the watercolor open in his hands, the half-finished mountains catching the early light. He heard her on the threshold and looked up, and something shifted in his face that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with what lay beneath it. She went to the desk. She set her father's leather satchel on the shelf beside the watercolor. Both empty now. Both carried far enough. He stood. He was very close, and she did not step back, and neither did he. His hand came up carefully and touched the line of her jaw, and she closed her eyes for one breath, and the warmth of his palm against her face was the last thing she had been waiting to receive. Outside the library window, Hartwood Hall's grounds were green and specific in the morning light, the stone balustrade wet from the night's dew, the apple tree in full leaf. Somewhere in the kitchen passage, Mrs. Holt was beginning the day. The house was waking. It was, by every instrument and legal record in Mr. Cope's capable keeping, hers. It felt like that. It felt like the shape of a thing returned. He said her name once more, very quietly, and she opened her eyes. The door to the library was theirs now. They stood inside it, together, in the early June light, and let the morning do what mornings do. If Cecily's journey stayed with you tonight, leave a word in the comments. Thank you for being here until the very end.